Okay, everyone. So thanks very much for joining us at this event. This is the first of an annual series that we've launched, and it's an event which is associated with our new center here, which is the Center for Knowledge, Technology and Society. As the name suggests, the idea is to showcase philosophical research which is applied and interdisciplinary. And one of the areas that we're interested in is education. So work at the nexus of philosophy and education. And this lecture series is meant to reflect that. And in fact, the idea is to focus specifically on topics in the epistemology of education, which is, I think, an important and growing field. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce the first speaker in this series as Harvey Siegel, who's Emeritus at the University of Miami. If you know the field, you'll know that he's by far the ideal person to start this, because he effectively has commandeered this field for the last generation. He's been a huge towering figure, and his work has been incredibly important in that field. So we're very excited to hear what he has to say today. The title of this talk is Rationality is the Aim of Education. And again, if you're familiar with the field, then you'll know this is very much a topic that Harvey's been and his work has been associated with. So Harvey, if you want to take it away.
Okay, let me see if I can get my slides up. And no, I don't want that. I think I want this. Yes. Okay, is that good?
Sorry, can I say one more thing? There's also the handout as well. There's a handout link if anyone wants it, which I think I meant to check this. Where is it? Is it in the chat?
Share it in a second.
Oh, we're going to share it in a second. So look out, there'll be a handout as well. It'll be in the chat. Sorry, Harvey, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Duncan. It's usual introductory overblownness, but I appreciate the sentiment anyway. And really, when Duncan says I've commandeered it, a more accurate description is that I stole it from Israel Scheffler, who really is the one who initiated it, at least as far as I can see. So as Duncan says, I've been doing this for a long time, and what I'm going to give today is just a kind of summary discussion of the various things I've argued for over the years. Okay, so let's see if this thing is going to work. Yes, okay. So let's start with a list of proposed educational ideals. Can I? So one of the things on the handout, when you get it, if you get it, is a long list of proposed educational ideals, which I'm going to reproduce now, but just very quickly. Oh, something's not right. I'm not being allowed to share my screen. There you go. Okay, so consider a range of ideals. Here's a bunch of ideals. Cultivation of curiosity, disposition to inquire, the fostering of creativity, production of knowledge, knowledgeable students, the enhancement of understanding, one of Duncan's favorites, the promotion of moral thinking, feeling, and action, the enlargement of the imagination, fostering of growth, development, fulfillment of potential, self-realization. These are all real ideals. I mean, that is, people have advocated for each and every one of these. I'm not going to give you sources here, but if you contact me, I'll be happy to give them to you. So we're only about a third of the way through. The cultivation of liberally educated persons, the opening of minds, overcoming of provincialism and closed-mindedness. I'm sorry, this is a bit, I'm having trouble finding my controls to, oh, there you go, okay. The development of sound judgment, cultivation of docility, obedience to authority. It's kind of contrary to what the ones we've been listing, but I'm sure you can think of people who have advocated for it. The maximization of freedom, happiness, self-esteem, development of care and concern, caring attitudes, fostering of sense of community, social solidarity, citizenship, civic mindedness, good citizens, civilizing of students, the protection of students from the deleterious effects of civilization. These are two very interesting pairings. I mean, a lot of people have argued that what education should do is civilize students, but famously, others have argued that civilization is the evil that education is supposed to protect children from. So I think of Rousseau in particular as advocating this last mentioned ideal. Development of piety, religious faith, ideological purity, political awareness. Okay, I won't keep reading all these. Let me just get to the last two: the fostering of the intellectual virtues and the fostering of the skills and dispositions of reason, rationality, or critical thinking. So I think it's fair to say that Duncan likes the second to the last of these more than I do, and I like the last more than he does, I think, but we'll see how that goes as we keep going. Anyway, if you take that big list, which is on the handout, and then just haul out and separate the epistemic ones, you get this list: the cultivation of curiosity, production of knowledgeable students, opening of minds, overcoming closed-mindedness, development of sound judgment, enhancement of understanding, and the fostering of the virtues, and the fostering of the skills and dispositions constitutive of reason, rationality, or critical thinking. So those are the epistemic ones that I'm going to say a little bit about each of them, but mostly I'm going to concentrate on the last one. And then the next, the one about virtues as a kind of contrast to my own view. So I say in this talk, I'll defend this particular educational ideal, that is the one on top, rationality and critical thinking, and relate it to some of the others. I take my cue, as I so often do, from Israel Scheffler. Let me stop and say something else about the handout. The handout has essentially two things. It has the list of proposed ideals and then quotes from several people, especially Scheffler, which are long. Some of them are long. And so I thought it would be easier for people, if they really want to follow up on this, to read them from the handout where they'll flow rather than from my slides, because some of them are broken up into 2 or 3 different slides because they're just too long to fit on a slide. So all that's on the handout. Anyway, Scheffler says, critical thought is of the first importance in the conception and organization of educational activities. From the same book, Reason and Teaching, rationality is a matter of reasons, and to take it as a fundamental educational ideal is to make as pervasive as possible the free and critical quest for reasons in all realms of study. And finally, finally, for this initial blast, the fundamental trait to be encouraged is that of reasonableness. In training our students to reason, we train them to be critical. Okay, so I want now to say a word about the place of critical thinking in the philosophy of education. So obviously CT stands for critical thinking. This is a claim I make that I have documented very thinly in 1 or 2 articles, but I think it's true. And if anybody thinks it's not true, I'd be very happy to hear from you and hear of who I've misidentified here. But I think as a historical matter, more or less every important philosopher of education has championed critical thinking as a fundamental educational ideal. And I have here a list of people who I think have done that. Rousseau, of course, is a philosopher of education of great note who didn't do this, so he's an exception. Nietzsche, I think you could argue, well, didn't do this, although whether or not he counts as an important philosopher of education, I don't know. But in any case, pretty much everybody else does defend it. So that is, they all advocate for the cultivation of the reason of students. So here are some quick definitions and slogans from the critical thinking literature. So this is Matthew Lipman, the founder of Philosophy for Children. So he says critical thinking is thinking that facilitates judgment because it relies on criteria, is self-correcting, and is sensitive to context. John McPeck says the appropriate use of reflective, calls it critical thinking, the appropriate use of reflective skepticism within the problem area under consideration. Richard Paul, another early theorist of critical thinking, calls it disciplined, self-directed thinking, which exemplifies the perfections of thinking appropriate to a particular mode or domain of thinking. Robert Ennis, perhaps the most distinguished contributor to the literature on critical thinking, defines it as reasonable reflective thinking, focusing on with deciding what to believe or do. Sharon Balin, another important figure, says it's a normative enterprise in which we apply appropriate criteria and standards to what we or others say, do, or write. And then there's my slogan, which is the last, which I just say it's appropriate to be a critical thinker is to be appropriately moved by reasons. So you'll notice there, my slogan is really about the person, the student, more than the thinking itself, but you'll see that they're both mixed in my view. So the key features of critical thinking, I think on pretty much all of these accounts, is that first of all, it's normative. It's a kind of good thinking. We want our students to think critically and not to think uncritically. Again, according to, I think, most of these accounts, if not all of them, critical thinking essentially involves meeting epistemic standards or criteria. So there's a little literature about the two words standards and criteria. Are they equivalent expressions, or do they mean something different? And different authors handle this in different ways. I think of the criterion or a criterion as the thing you're measuring someone against or measuring the thinking against. And the standard indicates a level of adequacy. So on my view, they differ in that way, but not everybody uses the terms in that bifurcated way. So we can talk about that if you want to. And then finally, a really key feature of critical thinking is that it involves dispositions as well as abilities. And because of that, we're going to have to spend a little time talking about the difference, if there is any, between critical thinking dispositions on the one hand and intellectual virtues on the other. So we're going to take that up toward the end of the talk. Okay, so here's my view. Critical thinker is one who's appropriately moved by reasons, and that includes two things. First, the skills or abilities of reason assessment. To be appropriately moved by reasons, I say, is to believe, judge, and act in accordance with the probative or evidential strengths of one's reasons or evidence. And that requires a solid understanding of the principles of reason assessment and the ability to utilize them. So when I say solid understanding of the principles, I'm really talking about epistemology. So epistemic principles like, really bland ones like believe in accordance with your evidence, to evaluating probabilities. I mean, all the things that epistemologists and other philosophers working in adjacent areas of philosophy think of as principles of reason assessment or criteria for the assessment of the goodness of reasons. So first thing is skills and abilities of reason assessment, which requires those principles. And then in the early days of critical thinking in the 1980s, maybe until the early 90s, there was a big dispute between the following two positions, whether or not principles of reason assessment are general or subject specific. And people like Richard Paul and John McPeck, and well, they're probably the main ones, especially McPeck, thought there are no such things as general principles of reason assessment. There are only subject specific principles. So he argued that you can't teach critical thinking or principles of reason assessment in general. You have to teach them in a subject specific way. So there are particular principles of reasoning that are relevant to the evaluation of, say, thinking in physics. And there were other principles that would be relevant to, say, thinking in history or thinking in aesthetics or art. That's the McPeck subject-specific view. That debate was raged in the 80s. I would say, and in the 90s, early 90s. I would say it's pretty much dead now. Nobody talks about it anymore. And whether or not it's been resolved, I'm not sure. I always thought there were both kinds, and it was not a big deal. You didn't have to choose one over the other. But it is something that people worried about. So on my view, critical thinker needs both general and subject-specific principles. And it's worth noting, this is a point that's been made well by William Hare, a Canadian philosopher of education, that subject-specific principles are not the same thing as subject-specific knowledge. So this is a mistake that I think, I think, and I think other people think too, that this is a confusion that plagued McPeck's discussion. He used to argue that, say, in order to think critically in physics, you need to know some physics, which everybody, I think, would agree with, and go from there to, so there are no subject-specific principles of reason assessment. There are only principles in physics. If it's physics reasoning you're talking about, then you have to talk about reasoning in physics. The principles have to be restricted to physics. I think that's just a mistake, but you can see how someone would make it if they didn't distinction between subject-specific principles and subject-specific knowledge. So anyway, my view is it's quite all right for someone to hold, and I would agree, that in many instances, you do need subject-specific knowledge in order to think critically about some issue. Not always, but sometimes, maybe a lot. So that you need both. Okay, but that's all the first component of critical thinking. The second one is what I call the critical spirit. I hate the words or the locution, even though I'm the one who started it. And for a while, I looked around for something better, but I just couldn't come up with anything. So if anybody has a positive suggestion, I would be very happy to hear it. In any case, what I mean by the critical spirit is just a set of dispositions, habits of mind, and character traits. And you need them, that is, you need the critical spirit to be a critical thinker, I claim, because it's not enough to be able to evaluate reasons well. You must be disposed to and actually do so. And we can all think of examples of people who are perfectly good at it, but they just never do it, right? If they did do it, they'd be fine. So you can think of, all kinds of scenarios. Choose your favorite absent-minded professor story, somebody who is brilliant, but who can't think his way out of a paper bag if it has to do with something practical. They would be strong on the reason assessment component, but weak on the critical spirit component. So, okay, that's the critical spirit. You need to seek reasons, evaluate them properly, believe, act, judge accordingly. That's what it is to be appropriately moved by reasons. So the critical thinker, I claim, must care about reasons and their place in the living of life. If you don't care about them, if you think, well, I'm pretty good at reason assessment, but I'm not going to pay any attention to reasons when I live my life. I'm going to, I don't know, go with the flow. Duncan and I were talking before about surfing. You could just decide to be a surfing bum, but without any kind of justification. Just I'm choosing that. I'm throwing in my lot, and that's that. I would say that is a failure of critical thinking. And so it raises the question about the relation between the critical spirit and the intellectual virtues, and we'll get to that soon enough. So here's a nice quote from Dewey. In general, I don't think Dewey is all that wonderful as a philosopher, but I think this quote captures perfectly the idea or the driving intuition behind critical thinking. Dewey says it's the business of education, quote, to cultivate deep-seated and effective habits of discriminating tested beliefs from mere assertions, guesses, and opinions, to develop a lively, sincere, and open-minded preference for conclusions that are properly grounded, and to ingrain into the individual's working habits methods of inquiry and reasoning appropriate to the various problems that, God, I wish I could get rid of this, that present themselves. So I think that's a nice capturing of the idea. Okay, so let me then say a word or two about reasons. So this is my way of understanding this. There are probably better ways of understanding it, and I'll be very happy to have your advice about it. But I want to say reasons have probative force. That is, they lend authority or weight to the things they're reasons for. To judge in accordance with that force is to be appropriately moved by reasons. That's what I mean by appropriately moved, right? Well, that's one piece of it. To judge in accordance with its probative force is to be appropriately moved by the reasons that you have. And, you know, that's really just another way of saying the very familiar philosophical idea of proportioning your belief, your credence to the evidence. That's what this first bit thing has to do with the probative force. If you're a good critical thinker, you can appreciate and evaluate probative force well. But reasons also have normative impact. To be impacted by them is to be appropriately moved by the reasons. So the first probative force is about the appropriateness of the movement, and the normative impact is about the movement by those reasons. And my claim is that you need both. Okay, so these are both key features of reasons. Critical thinking, the critical thinker must reflect both. Okay, so moving now to, well, why should we think that this is an educational ideal? And I'm going to offer 4 reasons for thinking so, although I'm only going to talk really about one of them. To consider it to be an educational ideal, you must take into account, oh, I see my computer is about to run out of batteries. Pardon me while I plug it in. There we go. The ideal, you must take into account both the thinking and the student doing the thinking. So the ideal is an ideal of persons as well as an ideal of education. And I think, or at least I have offered 4 reasons, or 4 reasons that I claim justify the ideal. At least I offer them in support of the ideal. So the first one is respect for students as persons, and that's the one I think is the most important. But there's also self-sufficiency. You want to educate students so that they can be self-sufficient eventually. Want to prepare them for adulthood, whatever, you know, in all the many ways in which they have to be prepared. And we want to get education once. We want our students to be educated so that they can participate well in democratic living. Now, obviously, that's a political idea. And if you're not a fan of democracy, then you're not going to be moved by that last reason. We could talk about that if you want to. I'm not going to spend much time on it today because I want to concentrate on the first one. The respect for students as persons, that's the most important justification of the ideal, I think. And my claim is that any education that does not aim to foster critical thinking fails to treat students with respect as persons, because any such education, no matter how benevolent in intent, any such education that there should be a that there, that fails to acknowledge its duty to enable students, oh, sorry, no, forget about that. Let me read it again. Any such education, no matter how benevolent in intent, fails to acknowledge its duty to enable students to determine for themselves the beliefs and values that will constitute and guide their lives. So that's a strong claim that I'll say a little bit about now. To so enable students is to foster their autonomy. So you want students to be able to, you want them to be treated with respect, and that means giving them room to be themselves, right? So that's the, and enabling students to foster their, to enable them is to foster their autonomy. That is, you enable them to think critically so that they can be competent drivers of their own epistemic engines, of their own lives, right? But you can encourage student autonomy without giving them any ability to do it well. To enable them to do it well, epistemically speaking, is to foster their critical thinking. So they should make their own decisions, but they have to do it in an epistemically respectable way, right? That's why this is an epistemic aim of education. And if you compare this one, critical thinking, with the other aims from the list, for example, the fostering of creativity or caring or a sense of community or intellectual virtue, our determining for students the value of these, however valuable they in fact are, as opposed to determining that value for themselves, amounts, I claim, to treating them as means to our ends rather than as ends in themselves. And insofar, it's to fail to treat them with respect. So the idea is the only way you can treat a student with respect is to do what you can to foster their critical thinking, because that puts them in charge of their own lives competently from the epistemic point of view. That's the idea. So if anybody defends some other ideal, then I'm okay with a plurality of ideals, but I think it's crucially important that any other such ideal has to respect the students as persons, right? And if it fails to do that, then no matter how good it might look from some other angle, it's not going to be a successful defense of that educational ideal. So obviously that's a moral imperative. And I think I'm repeating myself here now. We could enable them to determine their ends for themselves, thus fostering their autonomy. But if we don't enable them to do it well, we fail to foster their rational autonomy, and that's what we're after. And so our aiming to meet this moral imperative requires our regarding the fostering of critical thinking as a fundamental educational ideal. Okay, so there's obviously a lot more to be said about this, and my first book on this subject was all, well, a lot of it was devoted to this idea. I'm happy to talk with you more about it if you want in the Q&A later. Okay, now here's some quick throwaway lines about the epistemology underlying the ideal. I claim and have argued that if you're going to defend the ideal of critical thinking, then you have to embrace this small list of epistemic views. You have to be fallibilists. We have to be fallibilists. You have to have an absolutist conception of truth. Absolutist really should be in scare quotes there. All I mean is you have to have a non-epistemic view of truth, where truth is independent of justifications. That is, you could have a very well justified belief that's nevertheless false. You could have a very poorly justified belief that is nevertheless true. So truth is one thing, justification another. Our judgments concerning truth are always open to challenge and revision. That hooks it up with fallibilism. But justification, as most epistemologists would agree, is a fallible indicator of truth. So if you have strong justification for P, then other things being equal, you are entitled on the basis of that justification to think that P is true, at least to some degree, depending on the strength of the justification and whether or not we're talking about probabilistic credences or all or nothing belief. Either way, you have to regard justification as a fallible indicator of truth. So I claim these three epistemic views are part of what's needed for the ideal of critical thinking, as I want to articulate it, to be underlined. The last one, epistemological relativism, is rejected. Again, long story. All that needs serious unpacking. I'm happy to talk about any of it when you want, or send you to things I've written if you want. But I think the epistemology underlying the ideal has to at least involve this stuff. Okay, now a word about challenges to the ideal. So there are a lot of challenges over the decades, maybe over the centuries. First of all, there's the postmodern, by PM I mean postmodernism. There's postmodernist critique that critiques modernist conceptions of reason and rationality as, for example, overly individualistic or phallocentric or asocial etc. So that's one kind of challenge. There's the feminist challenge. I think here of people like Phyllis Rooney and Sandra Harding, Lorraine Code. There are no doubt many others who argue that the ideal, now really talking about the ideal of reason, Susan Bordeaux maybe, that the ideal is problematically male. That is, it upholds a sharp reason-emotion split where that's not good. It's linear where that's not good. It's anti-intuition where that's not good, right? So there's a whole host of objections or challenges there. Another objection is that it ignores the social conditions of knowledge. Helen Longino, arguably Alvin Goldman, although I think Alvin is much more sophisticated than to say it like that. And then there are a host of objections to truth. Rorty thinks it's redundant. A lot of folks think it's just a mask for power. A lot of folks think it's relativistic. A lot of people think it's just not very important compared to other values like Nietzsche. And those are all criticisms that need to be addressed and, well, have been addressed, at least to some degree. But they're all worthy objections that need to be considered. But I think there is a sort of general challenge that is put out now in the next bullet on the slides. To challenge reason and its cultivation as an educational ideal, as opposed to mindlessly rejecting it, one must challenge it on the basis of reasons. So you can only challenge it by embracing it. And because you can only challenge it by embracing it, the ideal itself cannot be successfully challenged. So this is a very quick version of a transcendental argument. Hello, Ryan. These arguments, transcendental arguments, are notoriously controversial philosophically. I totally agree. I'll just say a word about my version of this argument. The idea of a transcendental argument, as I understand it, is that something is necessary in order for something else to be possible. And so my claim in the main bullet point on this slide is, if it's possible to challenge reason or the ideal, or its cultivation as an ideal, then one must challenge it on the basis of reasons. And if that's right, then in order to challenge it, one must first embrace it. The embracing of it is necessary in order to launch the challenge. And if that's right, then it can't be successfully challenged. So we could argue about that too, and I would be happy to. Okay, now this is a point, the next few slides are about this, challenge to the status quo. So this is a point that doesn't get discussed very often, although I think it's absolutely important. And it's one of the main things that Scheffler argued for. And so on your handout, you're going to see 2 or 3 longish quotes, paragraph length quotes from Scheffler that make this point. So I'm going to have them up on the slides now, but really you'd be better off reading it on the handout. So critical thinking is potentially revolutionary in that it challenges, at least in principle, all commonly held beliefs and all political and social arrangements that are not based on good reasons. And for this reason, speaking practically now, it can be difficult to enact for both bureaucratic and political reasons, right? It might be hard to do bureaucratically because if you're running a school or a school system, you can't hold everything up for examination at once. You have to have some guiding, some rules, if that's the right word, to guide your decision-making and your educational practice. So it's problematic bureaucratically. And if you're a bureaucrat, you're going to think, oh, yeah, they're driving me crazy with yet more criticisms. Come on, let me just get on with the job. And of course, it can be difficult to embrace the ideal for political reasons too, because some people, some parents, for example, don't like it. But if the justification is successful, we should do our best to make it central to our educational efforts. And now here's the first long quote from Scheffler. So this is, let's see, The larger society that the school is said to serve at any given time cannot be taken for granted as providing an ultimate end. So think about that. So right now we are in a larger society that our schools are said to serve. We cannot just assume that our society is providing education's ultimate end. It, that is the larger society, must itself be judged worthwhile by reference to the rational standards and the heritage of critical values to which the school bears witness. If the fruit of knowledge is its use in life, it must be a life itself infused with a respect for knowledge and criticism. And the quote continues, to make education relevant by making it instrumental to the implementation of designated social values taken as ultimate, is to destroy its autonomy and to deliver it to the rule of uncriticized social values. To recognize, on the other hand, that the responsibility of education is not only to serve, but also to criticize, enlighten, and create. That its job is not only to provide persons with techniques, but more importantly, to provide techniques with critical, informed, humane persons, is to realize that it is education, has its own dignity and its own direction to follow. Its primary task is not to be relevant, but to help form a society in which its ideals of free inquiry and rationality shall themselves have become chief touchstones of relevance. So this is in a paper by Scheffler called, I forget the exact title, but it's something like On Educational Relevance, in which he criticizes the idea that we must make our education relevant to our current situation. You hear it all the time. One thing you often hear is that we need to make our students able to compete in the global economy. So that's our end, and we're going to bend our education to that end. And that might involve all sorts of things, but it certainly wouldn't recognize what Scheffler is talking about here, right? Here's another long quote from Scheffler. I think this might be the last one. To teach, so this is a paper it's called Philosophical Models of Teaching. To teach is thus to acknowledge the reason, in scare quotes, of the pupil, that is, his demand for and judgment of reasons. To favor the widest diffusion of teaching as a mode and as a model of cultural renewal is in fact a significant social option of a fundamental kind, involving the widest possible extension of reasoned criticism to the culture itself. That this option may, in particular societies, lead to great changes in fundamental norms, beliefs, and social institutions with respect to the prevailing culture is indeed possible, even highly likely. But such a consequence need not always follow. In particular, it is not likely to follow where the culture itself institutionalizes reasoned procedures in its basic spheres, where it welcomes the exercise of criticism and judgment, where it is democratic culture in its strongest sense. And the last part of this one long quote, this is from his book, Languages of Education. To support the widest diffusion of teaching as a model of cultural renewal is, in effect, to support something peculiarly consonant with the democratization of culture and something that poses a threat to cultures whose basic social norms are institutionally protected from criticism. So the idea is very clear. If your cultural setup is such where basic social norms are institutionally protected from criticism, then that cultural setup is problematic, and it's bad for society generally, and it's obviously bad for education on Scheffler's view. So this is the way in which critical thinking, I think, is rightly seen as a challenge, at least potential challenge, to the status quo. Okay, if I were there, I would stop now and let's have a discussion, but I guess I should just keep plowing through. I think we're well more than halfway through, so be patient a little bit, please. So I want now to, in what time we have left, to connect critical thinking to other epistemic educational aims and issues. So first is testimony, and you know about this. Everyone, but especially students, relies on testimony, especially from teachers. Can testimony-based beliefs be critical? And I say, of course. I may and typically do have good reasons to believe what you tell me. And, you know, same for you. One point in this literature about testimony that doesn't get enough attention as I think it should is a point made by Jonathan Adler in his book, Belief's Own Ethics. Adler notes that we have massive indirect background evidence of the reliability of testimony, and he calls it tacit confirmation. And his idea is if we lived in a world where testimony was systematically unreliable, we would know it, right? We would know it. We'd keep being brought up short by testimony that didn't achieve what it was meant to achieve for us, right? Because we ask, somebody tells, doesn't work, right? So if testimony was generally unreliable, we would know that, but we don't know that. And so there is kind of tacit confirmation of the reliability of testimony. So that's a point that I think deserves more play than it has gotten in the literature. But now think of it in the context of education, in the classroom. This is true of students and teachers too. Students, I claim, often have good reasons to believe what their teachers tell them. There's the point about tacit confirmation from Jonathan Adler. There's teachers being in positions of authority, their possession of relevant academic credentials, they're being treated as experts by colleagues, administrators, and parents. All that gives the students some testimony-independent reason for thinking their teacher is reliable, their teacher's testimony. But maybe more dramatically, think about classroom experience. Even if on the first day of class, the student has no testimony-independent reason to trust teacher pronouncements, as classes continue, the student sees the teacher introduce new material, hears the teacher's explanations, observes the teacher answering student questions, and speaking extemporaneously on matters arising during class discussions. All this provides the student with testimony-independent reason for trusting her teacher's testimony. And now, when I first made this slide, it was about Alvin Goldman's Intro to Epistemology students, because it was at a place where Alvin was. But now we're in Irvine, so consider Duncan's Intro to Epistemology students. By the end of the first class, don't they have good reason to believe what Duncan says about the conditions of knowledge, Gettier, etc.? It seems to me obvious that they do. They're not polished epistemologists yet. They're just at the very beginning of their Intro to Epistemology class. Nevertheless, they have good reason to believe what Duncan says about standard epistemological matters, especially at the introductory level. Okay, so that's it for testimony. If you want to talk about testimony more, by all means. Let's talk next about indoctrination. This is a fight I had with Alvin Goldman, well, you know, a journal fight with Alvin Goldman. The problem is that very young children especially need to trust teachers without reasons. Isn't that true? And I say yes. And here I refer to Goldman, Fricker, and the developmental stage of testimony reception. Right, that's Fricker's phrase is developmental stage. Students need to develop their, as she calls them, common sense view of things before they're in a position to consider the trustworthiness of testimony. Does this mean that we must indoctrinate students generally and into critical thinking in particular, because we need to get them to believe things without reasons? Right, that's the question, that's the challenge. And I say, well, you could talk that way. This is a question I think about using the word or the term indoctrination, or if you wanted to make it an issue in, what is the expression now? Conceptual engineering. Then we could be talking about how we want to engineer the concept of indoctrination. In any case, you could say that. You could say, yes, we have no choice but to get students to believe things before they can evaluate them on the basis of reasons. In fact, before they even know what a reason is. If you want to call that indoctrination, then we'd need a new distinction to distinguish acceptable from unacceptable indoctrination. But I think there's a cleaner way to do it. It's better, I think, to distinguish indoctrination, that is the bad thing, from non-indoctrinative belief inculcation in terms of style of belief. So this is this language of style of belief and an evidential style of belief. It's due to Thomas Green in a book in the early 70s, which I think the name of the book is The Activities of Teaching. And Green suggested that what we want to avoid indoctrinating our students is to give them or inculcate in them an evidential style of belief. And that style is that in which one can eventually inquire into the rational status of the belief, whereas a non-evidential style is that in which one cannot. So the idea is, and so my suggestion is just, let's just call the second thing indoctrination. Instead of calling it all indoctrination, use indoctrination for the latter thing, when you get students to believe things that they cannot then subject to rational scrutiny. So if teacher testimonial beliefs are held in an evidential style by the student, then even though they're acquired without justifying reasons, they can be redeemed by reasons. This is, again, an expression, actually, I think that's an expression by Green. It might be mine, I'm not sure. Anyway, those reasons, those beliefs can be redeemed by reasons when the student is in a position to do so. They are acquired non-evidentially, but once acquired, are eventually, given normal cognitive development, open to critical assessment. And if so, the unavoidability of student dependence on teacher testimony is compatible with the critical thinking aim. Okay, so that's my claim about indoctrination. Now we're going to talk about epistemic dependence. So I'm sure some of you have heard about this. John Hardwig had a famous series of articles, I guess, starting in the late 90s, maybe. And that's a quote from Hardwig. Rationality, he says, sometimes consists in refusing to think for oneself. And this is a kind of shocking claim, but it's a good claim. I mean, it's a provocative claim. And I think Hardwig is right. Sometimes it is. Rationality does consist in refusing to think for oneself. But if rational, this refusal has itself to be guided by good reasons. That is, you have to have good reasons to refuse to think for yourself on some given occasion. And of course, the good occasion might be you're not expert and somebody else is, right? That's the good reason. So this is Cody, J.A.C. Cody, if I'm remembering it right, that big fat book testimony, who says, the independent thinker is not someone who works everything out for herself, even in principle, but rather one who exercises a controlling intelligence over the input she receives. So that is, even when you are receiving input, sans reasons, nevertheless, you exercise a controlling intelligence over it. And if so, then you are not epistemically dependent in any pernicious way. And Emily Robertson makes the same point in this way. She says, this conception of epistemic independence, the one that she's been articulating before this quote, does not require the impossible task of extricating oneself from social influences, but rather that one become capable of evaluating and criticizing particular received views, assessing the credentials of experts, and examining the potential biases of social pathways to knowledge if there is reason to do so. And that, I think that captures well the basic idea, which is, in order to be epistemically independent, you don't have to remove yourself or extricate yourself from all social influences, because that's not possible, right? but we don't have to do that to be independent. To be independent, all we have to do is, as Cody said, exercise a controlling intelligence over what we do believe, even if we believe it without reasons. And Robertson unpacks that helpfully in this quote, I think. So one more slide on this topic, I think. Our judgments are not and cannot be disengaged when that is understood as freedom from the influence of language, conceptual scheme, and so on. There is no place to stand. We can't do that, right? As Quine put it famously, there is no cosmic exile, right? We can't somehow judge from the God's eye point of view, right? But we don't need that. What we want is our judgments should be disengaged in the sense that they're free of the undue influence of those dimensions of the influences that are rationally indefensible. And that we can do, at least to some degree. Of course, we're always judging from where we are. We cannot judge from nowhere, free of all conceptual schemes, because there simply is no viewpoint, no such viewpoint available to us. But that doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't do our best to escape from those judgments and influences that we have good reason to think do not deserve our allegiance. And if you think about this in particular cases, I think it's pretty clear how we do that. I mean, think about students who are who grow up or who are raised in, for example, very isolated communities, say the Amish community, or say an Orthodox religious community of one sort or another. We can, if we're critical thinkers, or at least, let me start that sentence again, to the extent that a student is a critical thinker, she can do her best to escape from those influences when she thinks she has good reason to think that those influences are too strong and don't deserve their strength. And I assume that this is at least in some small way, this is familiar to all of us when we become old enough to question our parents' religious beliefs. Certainly that was what happened to me when I was a teenager, but I don't think that's anything special about me. I think that's a very common experience. And it doesn't just have to be religion. It could be political, it could be any, whatever the big influences were or are on your early life. We do sometimes recognize that some of those influences are stronger than they deserve to be. And when we recognize that, we can endeavor to escape from them, or at least weaken their hold on us. And that's all we need for this point. So this is the continuous process of improvement of our beliefs. It does not require freedom from unavoidable influences, but rather that we strive to the extent we are able to exercise critical leverage over them. And that, I think, is the story the story we should tell about epistemic dependence. Okay, so there are two more topics. One next set of slides is about the enhancement of understanding. So here I'm waiting for Duncan to jump in on me. Well, maybe afterward. So there are a lot of people who defend this as an aim of education. Kate Elgin, Emily Robertson, Is Scheffler, Duncan, and many others advance this aim. And me too. I'm a fan of the enhancement of the understanding, of course. It is worth noting that what enhanced understanding is not entirely clear and is somewhat philosophically controversial. That is not that it's a good thing, but what it is exactly. So Robertson requires a holistic grasp of an area that involves seeing the connections. Israel Scheffler talked about that. His understanding of understanding was along those same lines. He talked about if you understand something, when you understand it in a general way, it's not all that helpful, but I think it's kind of the same point that Robertson makes here. And Duncan famously argues that understanding involves cognitive agency and achievement. And I'm down with all of that. But now think about what people understand or not. They understand scientific theories, historical events and trends, others' emotional states, works of art, right? There's a lot of things that we say people understand or fail to understand, or we want to understand. All those, but those things are very disparate. And so it's not obvious to me that there's a univocal sort of understanding that could serve as a fundamental educational aim. Maybe there is, but it's not clear to me that there is. But if there were one, wouldn't it involve the grasp of reasons? I mean, could you really understand, say, Newton's mechanics, that theory, if you didn't understand why the evidence Newton cited counted in favor of the theory? If you were evaluating a work of art, wouldn't you appeal to reasons that for thinking that, you know, this way of doing it in this context was an aesthetic plus? Same for think about interpersonal relations. If I want to understand why my partner is mad at me, I need to have some grasp of reasons, right? That would explain why she's mad at me. This is why she's mad at me, because I said that. And of course, she should be offended by that, right? So it seems like all of them, all sensible or commonsensical understandings of understanding would involve reasons. So I don't really see understanding as a rival aim, but rather as a complementary aim to the aim of critical thinking. And I would be happy to even regard them as kind of intertwined. That would be fine with me. So yes to understanding, but no, it's not something that should take the place of critical thinking. And notice that when we understand, when we hold up understanding as the aim of education, we still need the critical thinking dispositions. Understanding alone is not enough. Otherwise, you could understand and yet ignore your understanding when it was time to do something about it. So, but as I say, Duncan has a more positive view of this ideal than I do. So I look forward to Duncan giving me a hard time about this when we're done, which we will be soon, because now this is the last set of slides on the intellectual virtues. How am I doing for time? Oh, it's 5 o'clock already. Duncan, please feel free to shut me off anytime. I think I can do this fairly quickly, so give me another 3 minutes.
Sure, sure. Go ahead, Harvey.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question about the relation between the critical spirit and the intellectual virtues. And I agree, they seem to overlap enormously. So here's a list of critical thinking dispositions and attitudes. I won't read them in the interests of time, but if you look at this list and then compare it with Jason Baer's list of the intellectual virtues, I think you'll see that they overlap enormously. So here he's talking about carefulness, thoroughness, intellectual humility, intellectual generosity. All the lists overlap extensively. So you might think, well, maybe there's maybe this is just two different labels for the same thing, right? Maybe, I'm sorry, there you are. Maybe that intellectual virtues just are the critical thinking dispositions. And maybe that's right. I think we could argue about that. But here's a worry about it. I think I worry about virtue talk, because I think virtue talk immediately brings to mind Aristotle and the host of issues that philosophers wrestling with the Aristotelian virtue tradition have faced. The causes of the virtues, the explanation of some particular person's possession of some particular virtue, the nature and necessity of the motivational character of the virtues. This is one I particularly don't like, that in order to have the virtue, you have to be motivated in the right way. I think that's problematic. We'll get to it in a minute. The goodness or personal worth of the virtues, etc. All these problems are problems that virtue theorists have to face. Now, there's also a question about a competence condition, and I had a go around with Jason Baer about this. If you have the intellectual virtue of, say, open-mindedness, do you have to be competent at it, or is having the right motive or disposition enough? And I think, I wouldn't speak for any virtue theorists, but I think there is at least an ambiguity about this, that some virtue theorists do explicitly include a competence condition, others do not, and some reject the competence condition. Whereas critical thinking clearly requires competence. So that's an issue that has to be sorted out. But in this regard, dispositions require less than the virtues. So for the latter, for the virtues, the person in question must have the right motivation, the right affect or attitude, must take pleasure in their exercise. And all that seems to me problematic. Suppose a student exercises the disposition or the virtue out of duty rather than pleasure. So she doesn't take pleasure in its exercise. Does that mean she's an educational failure? That doesn't sound right to me. And again, can't she have the disposition without the ability? For example, can't she be disposed to seek reasons but be bad at seeking them? Let's agree, students who are virtuous are to be preferred to those who are not. I agree. Just as students who have all these other wonderful traits are to be preferred to those who don't have them. But are all these rightly thought of as educational ideals? I don't really see why. If we're serious about treating students with respect, what they become and what dispositions and virtues they value, possess, and manifest is importantly up to them. And while we strive to foster critical thinking abilities and dispositions in our students, we also invite them to evaluate for themselves the worthiness of these things and submit our judgments concerning and arguments for that worthiness to their independent scrutiny and judgment. The intellectual virtues, however excellent they are, can't be justified in the same way, I don't think. Rather, they must be justified in other ways, most of which I'm not going to talk about here, but consider this one. One such way of justifying the virtues, that is justifying them along broadly Aristotelian lines in eudaimonistic terms. This, I think, is more controversial and problematic than the Kantian justification, that is, the justification in terms of respect for students as persons that I favor. I think our educational obligation is not to deliver our students to flourishing lives or happy ones, but rather to prepare them to consider for themselves, among many other things, the virtuousness of the virtue and their place in their own lives. In this respect, educating for the virtues is more ambitious and contentious philosophically than educating for critical thinking. So here's Jason Baer's view about what they are, their character traits that make their possessor good or excellent in the relevant intellectual cum personal way, their personal intellectual excellences. But I worry that one person's virtue or excellence is all too often another person's vice. Consider, for example, the 2012 platform of the Republican Party of Texas. I only wish the Republican Party of California was as articulate as the Republican Party of Texas from 2012, because I would have loved to have used an example from them, but I didn't find one. So this is them. This is a statement taken from their what do you call them? Their declaration of their platform, right? We oppose the teaching of higher order thinking skills. This is a direct quote. So values clarification is in parentheses in the quote. Critical thinking skills. We oppose critical thinking skills and similar programs that are simply a relabeling of outcome-based education or mastery learning, which focus on behavior modification and have the purpose of challenging the student's fixed beliefs and undermining parental authority. So the 2012 Texas Republican Party opposes having students' fixed beliefs being challenged and having parental authority being undermined. That's pretty clear. Now, I would say we can infer directly from that quote that the endorsers of the platform reject the intellectual virtue of open-mindedness, since they reject educational programs that have the purpose of challenging the students' fixed beliefs. Now, of course, we could quibble about what do you mean by challenge, but let's go by that for the moment. I think defending critical thinking from this worry is straightforward. The defense offered above in terms of respect for students as persons succeeds. the endorsers are in effect rejecting the very idea that students should be treated with respect as persons. And this rejection is open to obvious and powerful challenge, most obviously, this is not in the slide, but most obviously by asking if they think they themselves should be treated with respect as persons. Because what they say is when they were students, they should not have been treated with respect as persons. That's what they're defending for the existing students, right, in the next generation. So I don't see how they can defend that. But it's not really clear how the virtue theorist would defend from this. I think they would have to require all the resolution of all the large issues at the heart of virtue theory we've seen. What are the relevant virtues? How are they individuated and justified? Why think there's a unified account of flourishing on offer? Here, the Texas Republicans seem on firm dialectical ground. If they don't antecedently agree that challenging fixed beliefs is a good thing, which they don't, what can be said that will demonstrate the error of their view, short of a thoroughgoing articulation and defense of virtue theory? How successful is such a defense likely to be, given their very different conception of human flourishing? And compare this point I'm making now is a point Kate Elgin made with respect to humility. For Aristotle, humility is a vice. For Christians, it's a virtue. So is it a virtue or isn't it? How are you going to resolve that debate? It would not be easy or straightforward, that's for sure. And similarly, I think the same kind of problem is for open-mindedness versus the 2012 Texas Republicans versus those of us who are friends of open-mindedness. So establishing the fostering of the virtues as a fundamental educational ideal, I think, is more ambitious and philosophically daunting than establishing the ideal of CT. Okay, so this is not to say that fostering of the intellectual virtues is not a legitimate ideal, but it is to say that the ideal of critical thinking, one, gets us at least most of what we want. It captures at least much of what is of value concerning the virtues. And three, enjoys a more established, less contentious justificatory path. I should say that Jason Baer thinks I'm wrong about all of this. So you cannot take my word for any of this, but that's what I think. So, okay, final slide. Lots of other things to consider. How should we understand rationality? How does it relate to the literature on epistemic rationality? I haven't said anything about that. Is the value of critical thinking instrumental only? I haven't said anything about that. Alvin Goldman says yes. I say no. How does rationality relate to multiculturalism? Huge issue in philosophy of education. But this has gone on far too long, and I'm sorry to have taken up so much of your time. So thank you for your patience. And we are done.
Excellent. Thanks, Harvey.
Okay.
Okay, so what we're going to do in the Q&A, I mean, I've got about 1 million questions, so I'll have to think about which ones I want to ask. But I see that some people have written questions in Q&A. You can also just raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then I can bring you into the room. And I think I'm going to resist the temptation to insert myself onto the list. So I'm going to, especially since it's quite noisy outside at the moment, I'll put, if I could bring Rena Goldstein into the room first to ask a question.
Hi, Rena.
So you'll see her in a second. Here we go.
There you are. Hi, Rena. I'm looking, how do I get, I'm trying to get back to the screen so I can see you all. How do I do that?
Hi, I'm also trying to start my video, but it says the host has stopped it.
That's not me. That's not me, I hope.
That's all right. Well, good to see you, and thank you so much for the talk. Interesting, as always. I thoroughly enjoy listening to you. I have a lot of questions, and I will say that you anticipated a lot of my objections, so that was masterfully done. And there are a lot of people here who are intellectual virtue proponents, so I'll sort of let them have the intellectual virtue questions. And there we go.
Oh, hello. I can see you now.
I'm going to ask you about, yeah, good. So I want to ask you about and sort of what you have in mind. You know, you said a couple of times, which I was pleased to hear, that you're a pluralistic. So times you went back to thinking about the fundamental aim, and that made me think, even though you're accepting of pluralistic aims, you still have a conception of there being a fundamental and an ideal aim, like one aim. And so, yeah, I was wondering, what does it get us to consider? I mean, I think it's really helpful to think through what it means to educate for critical thinking. But what is it that we get out of identifying a fundamental aim of education, as opposed to just always saying there are multiple aims? And
Oh, yeah.
Virtues and critical thinking. We don't need to.
Yeah, it's a good question, Rena. Thank you. In educating reason, I call critical thinking first among equals. So I do think there are other good aims. I think, I agree with Nell Noddings that caring is important. I agree with all those who say preparing students to live in democratic societies is an important aim. So I think there are many that are good, and I'm happy to include intellectual virtues in there. When I say critical thinking is first among equals, what I offer is an argument to the effect that for any of those other aims to be justified, they're going to have to be justified on the basis of reasons. And so if the justifying reasons are good ones, then they're actually engaging in critical thinking. So it doesn't make critical thinking more important, but it does make critical thinking sort of necessary to the justification of any of the others. And that's really as far as I think critical thinking needs to take us. So I don't say critical thinking is more important than various other things, although I do think it's centrally important. But I also think you can't get away without it, because if you don't have it there among your aims, you're not going to be able to justify any other aims.
Right, thank you. Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question? Okay, just one follow-up. Yeah, so this sort of seems like it gets into your transcendental argument.
Right.
And then I had a follow-up question for that. So it seems like you're right that we do require reasons in argument. And if I'm going to argue that intellectual virtues are a fundamental aim of education, I have to have good reasons. But then I'm not really clear why, like, to say that it's necessary for reasons in arguments doesn't seem to me exactly the same as saying educating for critical thinking is fundamental to education, because education isn't solely about arguments. I mean, there's maybe lots of things we can educate, like caring, that's an emotional, maybe having sympathy or understanding toward other people. That's not just about having good reasons.
Sure. Well, I agree. I mean, I hope I'm not just repeating myself. There are important moral aims of education and social political aims of education. So we want our students to be, for example, morally sensitive, to be able to recognize when moral claims are there in the room with them while they're deciding what to do. So that's not about critical thinking. It's kind of emotional sensitivity or something like that. So they're all, I'm perfectly happy for all those also to be important aims. And so you may be right that really the only reason critical thinking should be thought of as first among equals is that it's needed in order for any of the other ones to be justly considered to be genuine educational ideals. And you might think, well, who cares? I mean, really, moral sensitivity still is more important than being able to evaluate reasons well. And I don't really have an argument against that, except to say, well, don't make critical thinking so unimportant that you can't justify the thing you're trying to justify. As long as you don't go that far, I probably would be comfortable with however far you did want to go.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you again.
Thanks, Rena. So next on the list is Alfredo Alfaro. You're muted, Alfredo.
Hello?
Hi, we hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, go ahead, ask your question.
Okay. Okay. Let me pull it out. Because my concern was especially with this idea of indoctrination. I couldn't help but to think about, because it sounds like such a bad word for some, right? Like indoctrinating children or
Right.
whatnot.
Yep.
But I would say that under the conditions that we might find ourselves in, that maybe it can be viewed as countercultural practices or conditioning, right? Because I'm thinking about like old work, like saying that the function of schools is to, reproduce capitalism and stuff like that. So I just wanted to see your thoughts of this idea of countercultural practices or conditioning rather than indoctrination.
Well, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Alfredo. Are you suggesting that that we should indoctrinate students counterculturally so that they will resist the dominant culture? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, good. That's a good question. So you do want to liberate the students from an undue domination from the dominating culture. I agree with that. So you want to free them from the domination of the larger culture in which they are embedded. But do you want to do that by indoctrinating them into something else, something contrary to that culture? I think, well, I would have thought it would be better not to indoctrinate them into something else, but rather to help them to see how they have been indoctrinated into the values and beliefs of the dominating culture and discussing how to resist them. Excuse me.
Okay.
Especially if they need resisting. I mean, it's not like all cultures are monolithically evil. There may be things worthy of acceptance in a dominant culture, and then other things that need to be questioned or challenged. So I think rather than indoctrinate them counterly, that is, indoctrinate them in a way contrary to the way the dominant culture is trying to indoctrinate them, it would be better to help them to think critically about whether or not they're being indoctrinated, and if they think they are, what they should do about that. So I'm very much in favor of resisting the domination of the dominating culture. That's where all that stuff about the status quo, resisting the status quo, comes in. So I'm with you there. I just don't see why you would want to just turn around and indoctrinate them into something else rather than free them from indoctrination.
True. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfredo. Next on my list is Cheyenne Durudi.
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you, Cheyenne.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I can't turn my video on right now, but let me find my question. So yeah, I was basically asking, and it might be because I misunderstood that. It sounds like based on response to the previous questions that, these things aren't, you can have many aims, but I was basically asking, if the main aim is to have rationality or critical thinking, to what extent is teaching domain specific content justified? So for example, teaching math, physics, literature, and things like that. Is it useful insofar as it helps people develop the critical thinking skills? Is critical thinking useful to learn those subjects, or are they sort of just separate goals?
Well, it's another good question. I think if you didn't educate students at least the fundamentals of literacy and numeracy, that you would be putting them at a terrible disadvantage for the rest of their lives. I mean, not being able to read is, if you've ever been to a foreign country where you don't read that language, you know how debilitating it is. You just out of the picture. You're out of all social interaction almost. So I would say you certainly want to make sure students know how to read and count and do all those basic things. But of course, you want them to be able to do much more than that. So you want to teach them a lot of subject-specific stuff. I'm fine with that. That was the point about you shouldn't think that if the principles of reason assessment are subject-specific, that means that, are general, then that means that there is no subject-specific knowledge. Surely there is subject-specific knowledge, and we want our students to have as much of it as they can manage and want to manage. So there are real questions here about how far you should push those things. Should you make students, for example, take calculus in high school when they're really artsy students and don't have any intention of studying anything sciencey or higher mathy in their future life or using any of it in their future lives? I think it's arguable that maybe you shouldn't bother teaching them that. And on the other hand, if they want to learn it, that's different. And there are plenty of math educators who say that that is public high schools in the US, and I assume elsewhere, spend way too much time teaching students things that really aren't very useful to their future lives. So I know of people who argue, don't bother teaching them calculus, teach them probability or statistics, because that's much more, they'll be able to get much more out of that in their post-educational lives. Those are good questions. And I don't have a ready, simple answer to just what exactly should they be taught. My own instinct is to think that should be discussed openly with children and parents and teachers and school board members and principals, and should be decided on the basis of good reasons.
Great, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Shan. Next on my list is Nikolay Tarabanov.
Is there a reason why nobody's turning on their cameras?
Yeah, I don't know. But it does seem like people can't. Let's see if Nikolay can.
Yeah. Well, at least I got a picture now, so I can see what you look like, Nikolay. But if you want to turn your camera on, that would be nice.
I wonder if some people are not in a position to turn their camera on in terms of where they are. And
yeah, it's fine. If you can't. I understand. Anyway, I'm ready for your question, Nikolay.
Well, shall I ask it, Nikolay? Do you want me to ask it? Okay, I think there's a technical glitch there. Nikolay, I'll ask you a question for you. So if you can, if it starts to work, just speak and we'll know. So Nikolay was asking in the Q&A, how does epistemology of education relate to Popper's critical rationalism? In particular, what do you think about his quote, epistemology without a knowing subject, unquote?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Nikolay. I have taught a lot of Popper in my day, and I like a lot of Popper, but I also don't like a lot of Popper. One thing I don't like about Popper is what you just called his critical rationalism. So you probably know that one of Popper's students, Bartley, tried to go one step further than Popper and say he argued for what he called comprehensively critical rationality, where the question, why should you be rational, is itself a question that should be open to discussion and justification. Because Popper says no. Popper says you have to start with an unjustified faith in reason. He has that expression, faith in reason. I could get you, I can't think of the source off the top of my head, but I know I have it. If you want me to point out to you where he says it, it's in the Open Society, one of those books. But anyway, email me and I'll send you the page, the quote. So he says, you can be rational about everything, or critical, and you should be critical about everything, Popper says, but only up to the point where you ask, should you be critical about rationality itself? And there he says, no, you can't be. You have to simply embrace it, in effect, on the basis of faith. He does use the word faith in this context. Whereas I think, I'm on Bartley's side. I think, no, even that question should be answered. So in my Rationality Redeemed book, there's a chapter in which I try to answer the question why we should be rational. And I don't know if my answer is any good or not. Maybe it doesn't succeed. But if it succeeds, then it means that Popper draws the line too soon. He shouldn't say we have to be rational about everything, but not about that, because we can't be rational about that. I mean, he thinks he has an argument for why we can't be rational about why we should be rational. But that argument, I think, doesn't work. So I would say that Popper's critical rationalism is in many respects in keeping with what I've argued for today, but he says you can't ask the question, why should I be rational? I think that's a mistake. And then the other big thing in which I disagree with Popper, and pretty much everybody disagrees with Popper on this, is that Popper rejects induction. But if you reject induction, then there's all kinds of things that you can't justify. And so I think it's important that we don't go all the way with Popper, at least insofar as his rejection of induction goes, and his unwillingness to rationally consider the question, why should I be rational, goes. Those would be my two big hesitations with respect to Popper. I hope that makes sense, Nikolai.
Well, he said yes in the chat, so thanks.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Maybe I could come in on that point, because it sounded to me, your transcendental reply looked to me very much like you were saying it's not possible to critically reflect on critical reflection, precisely because that was somehow self-undermining. Which
No, I was saying the opposite, that you, sorry, I cut you off. Please go ahead. But I think I was saying the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, but if any objection to it would presuppose rationality, then that seems to imply it can't be objected to, therefore it can't be itself rationally evaluated.
Well, it can't be, okay, so right, good. That's good. You're forcing me to make clearer what I was trying to say. It's not that you can't question it. It's that any such questioning is doomed to failure. You could, I mean, imagine people who really do question it, who say, why is it better to reason all the time when I could be, chanting Hare Krishna, or surfing, or spending my time making wildly creative art, where I'm trying desperately to get away from the strictures of reason, from the bounds of reason. There are people who do that, right? And of course, there are philosophers who challenge reason. Well, I don't need to list them, you know them as well as I do. So I don't say that the question can't be asked. What I say is the question can be asked and it has an answer. And the answer is my transcendental argument. So I don't know if that helps.
Well, no, because the issue is not really whether you can ask the question, because of course, one can utter any set of words in the form of a question. It's more, I thought you were saying we know in advance that you can't rationally ask the question. And that looks to me like what you're saying is there can't be a rational evaluation of this claim.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you can't rationally ask the question. I'm saying that when you do rationally ask the question, you thereby commit yourself to the positive answer. That is, you should be rational. Because let me say a little bit more just to get it all out on the table so you have more targets. If you are seriously wondering whether or not you should be rational, then you're asking the question, why should I be rational? But I'm assuming you're really serious about it. You want to know why. Well, if you want to know why, then you're asking for reasons why you should be rational. That's what it is to ask why seriously. So you're asking for reasons, and that's perfectly legitimate. And when you ask for reasons, I am then in a position to say, but that means you want me to give you reasons. So I guess you do value reasons. So that's your answer. You should be rational because you value reasons. You commit yourself to a positive attitude towards reasons, at least good reasons, in the very asking of the question.
So yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but just one more thing.
Go ahead, yeah.
To misunderstand what transcendental arguments do, because all they show you is what you're committed to. So all that follows from that is, in questioning the rationality of critical thinking, you're committed to the rationality of, in questioning the reasons, a reasons-based approach, you're thereby committing yourself to reasons because you're
right.
You're actually valid. So that doesn't give us any reason to think that this is a good approach or that we do have reasons or anything like that. I mean, transcendental arguments don't give that. All they show you what you're committed to.
No, yeah, that's right. You're right about that. Transcendental arguments don't do that. So what my argument is intended to show is that you can only challenge rationality meaningfully by committing yourself to being guided by reasons. So that's a kind of dialectical position that I'm staking out.
But I thought you were saying that the conclusion of that was that you do now have a reason for the reason.
Well, you in the asking of the question have a reason to take reason seriously. You have committed yourself to it. Now, that I agree with you. That does not show that we should be rational. But don't you think it's pretty important thing to notice that the challenging of the thing requires the commitment to the thing? That seems to me quite an important point to make, even if it doesn't give you what you were looking for, which is something like a non-question begging reason for valuing reason.
I guess it just doesn't seem to give me very much. I mean, compare like free will. Someone's skeptical about free will and they challenge it. And I say, well, look, in the mere project of challenging whether you have free will, you're presupposing you've got free will, right? Because it makes
but that's not right.
That's not the reason that you've got free will. I'm just saying you're committed to it. And it seems like that's all.
No, but I don't think that's right. I mean, a real determinist would not concede that in asking that question, he's committing himself to free will. He's saying, I'm a determinist and I don't, whatever it is that's determining my asking this question or my having this view is what it is. Nevertheless, I'm asking that, but that he's not committing himself to free will. So I don't buy that analogy.
Yeah, well, I don't know if the determinist can do that, then it seems to me if someone's critiquing reason could do that too, right? Because they could say, oh yeah, well, that's just your interpretation of what I'm doing. I don't accept that interpretation of it.
No, well, I agree with you that they could reject my interpretation. So then I would want to know, okay, please tell me the correct interpretation of your challenge. You're asking why you should be rational. What would count as a meaningful answer to you?
Could I ask, that wasn't my question anyway.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, Duncan, if you want to, I don't know if you have Rationality Redeemed, but there's a chapter there where this argument is laid out. So feel free to cut it to shreds.
No. I mean, I actually agree with what the transcendental line. I think it shows a lot less than I think you might be thinking.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think I agree with you about that. I think it shows a lot, but it doesn't show everything.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask though is this issue, which is the fundamental issue, really, intellectual virtues versus critical thinking. I want to put a bit of pressure on that. It seems to me they're such natural bedfellows. There's so much overlap. I've never really understood why we're not on the same side.
Well,
and let me just let's try and see if I can pinpoint what it is.
Ahead.
I mean, for example, this project we have at UCI, we often interchangeably describe it in terms of cultivating intellectual virtues and cultivating critical thinking skills.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
well, that's good to know. That's good to know.
Now, here's one reason why you might think they come apart, and you talked about this at the end, which is the dispositional component to the virtue. They have a dispositional component which is essential to them. You have to care about the truth. You can't just employ them strategically or what have you.
Right.
Not how they operate. And you could certainly, the way of thinking about critical thinking skills where you just teach them strategically. You know, you have a bunch of lawyers, let's say, you say, look, here's some skills. They're really,
Right.
you don't have to care about reason or truth or anything.
Right. Right.
And we can think, well, let's just extend that to education.
Right.
And I thought you would be inclined towards that. But the trouble is that seems to be in tension with the view. So at the end, you were kind of going for that distinction. But at the beginning, you also said that on your view, it's not enough just to have the critical thinking skills. You have to be appropriately motivated by reasons. And that
Yes. You have to be appropriately moved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that looks to me like exactly what intellectual virtues theorists say about the dispositions involved. Now, I noticed when you talked about it the other time, you said there was this thing about pleasure or something, but that strikes me as being incidental. I mean, what's important is this motivational care, concern for the truth, to be genuinely moved by reasons. It seems like the thing that the core idea is exactly the idea that you had at the beginning, that it's not enough just to simply have certain skills. You have to be appropriately moved to respond to reasons.
Yes.
If that's in there, then it looks to me like the distinction between the two, it starts to vanish now.
Yeah, no, it's good. This is an excellent point. I've gone around and around with Jason about this, Jason Baer. In a way, I feel like I'm a victim of my own history, because when I started writing about dispositions and critical thinking, virtue epistemology hadn't started yet. So I think you are right that there is a sense in which I was arguing for virtue epistemology before there was a virtue epistemology. Of course, I didn't use that language and I had no idea that that would happen. But you're right, the positions are close. It's only in arguing with Jason or interacting with his texts that I thought, no, there really is a difference here. So so think about the you were talking. I think you just said something about love of truth, right? You want to ground it all in something like love of truth, right?
Well, there's a necessary dispositional. There's a necessary motivational component. That's what I would put it. It's not grounded in it, but that you can't manifest the virtue strategically.
Right. No, and I'm with you against the strategic part. I agree. And in my epistemic rationality stuff, that's the very line I argue. So I'm with you there. The question is, so you have to be, for it to be a virtue, you have to be, you have to take pleasure in the exercise of the intellectual virtues, right? Doesn't Jason say that? Doesn't Aristotle say that?
I don't like the word pleasure. That's too, I mean, I think there has to be a concern and a respect for truth or something. I would put it like that. Pleasure seems to me, whether you take pleasure or not, seems to be like
well, the important core of my objection to the virtue stuff is that very point you just made, that it's pleasure should have nothing to do with it. So suppose I really am committed to the truth and I value the truth very highly, and all my intellectual endeavor is guided by it. But I don't do it because I love the truth or take pleasure in the truth. I do it because, I don't know, something to do with my early toilet training, that I don't really understand it, but that's how I am. And I don't take pleasure in it, but nevertheless, that's what I do. It seems to me that if I do it, then even though the actual motivation is something not very pretty, that it should still count as exercising the appropriate disposition. But as I read at least the character virtue theorists like Jason, I think they think it really has to be something you take pleasure from. And I'm with you, pleasure should have nothing to do with it. So I'm caught here. I mean, I agree with you that really my view is a virtue view, at least as that notion is ordinarily understood, but not by all the virtue theorists in epistemology who are around these days. So I think it's partly a matter of fitting myself into something that started after me. And,
Yeah. So
and I don't really know how to handle it.
one way of interpreting that would be that your opposition isn't to virtue, isn't to the intellectual virtues as the overarching intellectual goal of education per se. It's to a particular rendering of that claim.
Yeah, that would be fine. That would be fine. And the point about when you are educating for the fostering of the intellectual virtues, it has to be in such a way that the students are treated with respect as persons. And that, I think, is a further point that I think a virtue theorist could acknowledge, but doesn't need to acknowledge. But please.
This is the other thing, because I think this is the two things, like where they, if there's distance, it's here.
Yeah.
The other one, like the person's thing. I mean, I think you seem to be suggesting that having any kind of eudaimonic conception of virtue would be somehow like an indoctrination or something. It would be like adding an element to bring in values that aren't essential or something like that, which you have to be further defended. Or is that the thought? Whereas a respect for the person's idea is just, that's self-standing idea. That's like a thin idea, it's self-standing.
Yes.
A eudaimonic idea brings in further claims, value claims, and that's going to be problematic. Was that?
Well, I think one big problem I have with Aristotle is I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all account of flourishing. So I'm dubious about the very idea of flourishing. Not that I'm against flourishing. I'd be delighted if I flourish. I'm happy, and I hope everybody else is too. But I don't think there is a thing that is flourishing, and so I'm worried about putting my eggs in that basket.
Notice though, we don't have to commit ourselves to a particular account of flourishing. I mean, what the million-dollar question really would come down to whether critical thinking, as you understand it, would be a component of a good life, a life worth having in the broadest sense. And I would have thought that you'd be down with that.
I am down with it, except I don't want to put it in terms of the good life, because again, I'm suspicious of there being such a thing as a good life. I believe there are many lives that are good, and I don't.
But remember, we're not committing ourselves to any particular account of the good life. We're just saying, is there anything which is a common feature of all things that would count as a good life, however pluralistically you want to understand that? And I would have thought you would say critical thinking is, but that's why it's part of an educational goal.
I would say that, but if you, so let's agree on this much. If you will allow me to be as pluralistic as you just suggested I can be, with respect to flourishing and with respect to the constitution of a good life, even insofar as not being committed to any particular type of theory of the good life. So I don't have to be what do you call it, an abstract list theorist, or I forget what the other categories are, but if I can be pluralistic in that broad sense, then I would agree, and critical thinking would be part of it.
Excellent. So we've achieved our ironic goal then. Now this is like a synthesis as a match.
We should stop now.
Okay, so we've got some questions, and I want to bring back in actually Rena now, because she has questions in the Q&A which I think relate precisely to this discussion.
Sure. Okay. Hello again, Rena. Hello. Oh, saw you for a minute. There you are.
Yes. Well, I probably, Duncan, you might be able to articulate this better than me. But I was just wondering if it seemed like maybe some of the problems with the virtue approach, Harvey, was pertaining to the motivational component. And so you can have a virtue account that doesn't have that kind of motivational component. So then you have something like a reliabilist account, or taking on some of maybe what Sosa puts out there. I don't know. And I don't want to misconstrue that account. So if Duncan, you want to fill in some details about what a reliabilist account would look like, maybe that would be helpful, or maybe Harvey, you already know. And then I was just curious what your thoughts were about that kind of virtue approach, and whether that would be something you're more sympathetic to.
Yeah, you're going to have to spell it out a little bit more than that, because I'm not yet sure what we're talking about.
Duncan, can you help me? Because I just don't want to say
So,
something wrong and
So
misconstrue.
there is this, I mean, I think the real contrast for you in the educational sphere is responsibilist accounts of virtue. For example, the Aristotelian type accounts, which have motivational components in there, which are essentially reflective in the cultivation and development, acquisition and cultivation of virtues and so on. But there is there's a broader reliabilist view of virtues. I mean, Goldman, I guess, could even be there. Sousa at one point,
Yeah.
I think he's moved across that. Greco. I mean, actually, whenever they talk about education, though, because usually it's a broad view, and then so the idea is you still have all the Aristotelian components, but you also have faculties and things like that in the picture too. Skills, broadly speaking, which needn't have skills can be strategic; they don't have dispositional components and so on.
Right.
So yeah, with education, I think usually they sort of narrow down and focus on the more elevated traits rather than the lower ones. And the lower ones are more relevant to knowing rather than to whatever it is we're doing when we're in education.
Right.
But that might be, I take Irina's thought as you say, well, look, there's this broader sense of virtues, doesn't involve just an excellence of character. It doesn't have to be an excellence in the Aristotelian sense of like character traits. It's just a sort of, we can be, I can be excellent in being good at throwing things or whatever, that's an excellence. It's not an excellence of character, really. There's
Right.
kind of
Right. Yeah. Well, so I mean, the more broadly we conceive of the virtues, the easier it is for me to accept them. So I don't have any problem if we make them really broad. But as I understand reliabilists like Sousa, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Duncan, what makes something a virtue is its tendency to produce truth, right? True beliefs, right? So vision is a reliable virtue, right? Or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but right, it counts on the plus side of virtue, epistemic virtue, because it reliably produces truths, right? So if that's what you mean, then a big worry I would have, and this does come out in my discussion with Goldman, is that you run the risk of letting critical thinking and virtues now be strictly instrumental, which I don't like. So that was one of the big criticisms I made of Goldman, that he made it. He saw the value of critical thinking being solely instrumental. And that seems to me too narrow.
It does seem like that's one big divide where critical theorists like you and virtue theorists are on the same side.
Yes, right. So I'm not against reliabilism per se, but I don't think it does the work we want to do in education, because
Right.
Oh, okay, good. I
Well,
can stop
well,
there.
yeah, I mean, I think, but maybe, I mean, yeah, maybe the theory, the whole theory isn't great in education, but because I was hearing you sort of push against the motivational components that responsibilists bring in, and so I don't know if there's a way to borrow at least that aspect of reliabilism into a view that you're going to be comfortable with couching under a broader subheading of, or a broader heading of, virtue epistemology, or virtuous aims in education, something like that.
What you're asking
But
me,
also,
sorry, you just cut out.
You're on mute.
oh yeah, I muted, because if you want to respond to that, and then I had another question, that something you said.
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds like what you want me to do is bring in the non-motivational part of reliabilism. Well, but I can do that without bringing in reliabilism. I just reject the motivational part. Although, as Duncan has already established, I don't reject the motivational part, at least not überhaupt, not totally. I think motivation is important in many respects with respect to critical thinking. So I don't want to go full bore reliabilist or full bore anti-motivation. I just think I think there's a danger that the responsibilist virtue theorists like Jason Baer is the one I know the best. I think he puts too much into the exact nature of the motivation that's necessary in order for something to count as a virtue. And that's what I don't like. And the idea that you have to take pleasure in its exercise just seems to me ridiculous. Why should you have to take pleasure in it? I mean, if I don't want to spin off into craziness, even though I know I'm talking to California here. So I won't do that. But I'm just worried about the talk of motivation and requiring pleasure in the exercise of something for it to be a virtue. I think it has to be handled more carefully than Jason handles it. And if that can be done, okay. Because I agree, motivation is important in some ways. I am worried about those other questions about the virtues of I mean, what do you say about the Texas Republicans who are opposed to open-mindedness? Because
they're wrong.
Sorry?
They're wrong. They're wrong.
Well, I think they're wrong too, but how do you establish that?
But I don't really understand the point there, because aren't virtue theorists in a good position there, because they have an account as why they're wrong. They say, look, here's this integrated account of the virtues and why they're important. And here's
but
I mean, of course, there'll always be disagreements as to any claim. There'll be disagreements.
But the Texas Republicans reject it. They reject the virtue account because they say, look, open-mindedness is a vice.
But certainly they would reject the critical thinking account. They don't reject any account, wouldn't they? That's
they would reject any account that doesn't involve fundamentally indoctrinating children into the views of their parents. That's what they want out of education, and they're quite upfront about it. But you have to applaud them for their openness. At least it gave me a good example. But yeah, so if you could win that argument, that would be fine. But I think my way of defeating them is easier, because they want to claim for themselves the right to be, they want to honor their ability to be open-minded, because when they're making their case, they take themselves to be making it in an open-minded way. And yet they refuse to allow their children to become open-minded through their education. But then there's going to come a magic moment when the children get to be adults, and then they take over the Republican Party. And now they have to think open-mindedly, and oh no, we just educated them not to be that way. I think that's a real problem for the Republicans those Republicans of 2012 Texas.
You see, I don't think they care about open-mindedness at all, children or the adults. So, they just have different. So I mean, I think you just have to accept that there'll always be people who have different points of view on this. I don't know if it follows that that's a problem for anyone. I mean, a problem for everyone's view, a problem for no one's view, I think. So
Okay, that's yeah.
Yeah, I have another question, if I may. So something you said about instrumentalism is another reason to sort of reject the reliabilist account. And then this is going to be kind of clarificatory, because it's something you kind of mentioned quickly, and so maybe you could just go back to this point again. You talked about when you were giving reasons to prefer the critical thinking aim over something like the caring aim. You talked about the incompatibility about means end. Sorry, my notes aren't too good. Or I didn't write down it in such detail. But you mentioned something about means and ends. And I don't know if you wouldn't mind repeating that point, and then I think I'll be able to ask my question a little bit better.
I don't remember a point about means and ends. Was it in the slides?
Yeah, I think, and it was early on, and I think that you mentioned you think that we should treat students not as an end in and of themselves, but as a means to an end.
It's the Kantian point you're making.
Oh, yeah. So I'm making the opposite point. I'm just looking on the slides for them. Okay, so I think I'm in the right neighborhood. So let me share the screen. Where am I? Here I am. Oops. Okay, sharing the screen. So, Rena, help me out here. Is this the slide that you've got in mind?
Let's see. Maybe back it up a little bit more.
Well, okay, this is the next one, and that's the next one yet. So, okay, I'll go back. That's the first one. So there's nothing here about
means and ends.
Means and ends. Let me, wait a minute. Duncan said it. Let me go for Kant. See where Kant is here. Oh, this is, okay, so this is near the end. Is this where we are?
No, it was definitely near the beginning. Sorry, let's see if
Okay.
there's another one. No, yeah.
Okay, hang on.
Oh, someone said try slide 21. Oh, no, that can't be if it's near the beginning, I suppose.
I thought it was, yeah, I think it was somewhere after the critical spirit. Yeah, it's closer to the critical spirit slide. There's the critical spirit slide.
Right.
And B, I think it was a little after the B. Let me see if it's there.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I'm reading.
Oh, I've got slide 16 up.
Yes, I see it.
Is that the one?
Let me see. Can I see slide 17?
Of course. This is a quote from Dewey.
Oh yeah, this is Dewey's quote.
We've had two suggestions of slide 21. Do you want to go to slide 21?
Yes.
Oh good, somebody else maybe.
That's where I was at the beginning.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, well, let me just address the question because I'm not sure what slide. You all have these slides, so you can look at them later and find what you need to find and then email me.
Sure.
I think Ryan already sent everybody my email. If you respect students as persons, then you have to treat them as ends, not means, rather than means. So I hope I didn't say something contrary to that. Did I?
That's treating them as means to our ends. Let's see.
No.
Rather than ends in themselves.
This one. So, right. So
Yes.
in other words, if I determine for students the value of some virtue, if I say to a student, open-mindedness, this is a virtue. You have to become open-mindedness. And I don't want you to think about whether or not open-mindedness is a good thing. Just be open-minded. And my education goes that way. Then I am treating the student as a means to my own end rather than letting the student choose her own ends. So that's the idea. That's why I think really a workable notion of intellectual virtue has to honor students, has to treat students respectfully as persons. I think so. I don't see why a virtue theorist should disagree about this, except that I think, as I understand virtue theory, it's not usually included. Baer's book doesn't have anything about it. Zagzebski's book doesn't have anything about it that I can remember anyway. So I'm just not sure that this is a point that is honored by the virtue theorists, the epistemic virtue theorists. But if they were to accept it, then that would be fine. Then we would be in agreement. If we want students to think critically about everything and determine for themselves what's worthy of their belief, then that should extend to their thinking about the virtues themselves. They ought to be able to think critically about the virtues too.
Right. Okay. So can I ask a question then? So yeah. So I understand your point is that sort of with the virtues, we sort of dictate what virtues are. You know, we do with good reasons dictate that open-mindedness is a virtue. And in that way, students are not learning perhaps to value these for themselves, except for by maybe valuing the reasons that we have for them in some way like this. So then we're kind of back to your transcendental.
Well, but I'm not saying it has to be done that way. I'm just saying there's a danger there. We don't want it to be done that way.
Right.
If you do it that way, then you're failing to treat them with respect. But you certainly can do it in such a way that's treated with that they are treated with respect.
Sure.
Just like you treat them with respect to anything else. So if you're in world history in 10th grade and you're talking about the causes of the French Revolution, well, there are various accounts that explain the causal nexus differently, and a teacher certainly could offer her own view of the causal preliminaries to the French Revolution, that is the social forces that brought it about, maybe the economic forces as well. But that's got to be done in such a way that students can say, wait a minute, I don't think that's what caused it. I think there's something else. And they might point to, a feature of French character at that time, or what's going on in the Far East, or, there could be any other account of it. So I think it's possible to teach about virtues, just like it's possible to teach about causes of an important historical event. And you can do it in a respectful way or in a not respectful way. And I think it has to be the respectful way if it's going to be any good.
Right. Okay, so here's my question or comment, I guess. But it seems like critical thinking, so let's just take it that we're teaching children and about, virtues in the most respectful way. And, we're using critical thinking to do that. But critical thinking is itself a framework. I mean, it's something we teach to children as a way to structure their beliefs, as a way to appreciate evidence. And in that way, I don't really see how the framework of critical thinking that we might, transmit to students is any different than the framework of virtues that we might to me, it seems like it's sort of subject to the same worries here.
Well, I agree with you. So critical thinking, teaching for critical thinking also has to honor this requirement of mine. So you have to teach critical thinking in such a way that it too can be challenged and thought about critically. That's part of the view for sure. So yeah, if you are right, Rena, that there is no difference between educating for intellectual virtue and educating for critical thinking on this point, then that would be great. And I would say, great, we're both on the good side of this divide.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks. We have a couple of questions that came in late to the Q&A, but I think we should stop there because we're already over time. So we should thank Harvey for an extremely stimulating and useful talk. Actually, I think if you're not familiar with these debates, you certainly have got a great overview of the issues here, and in particular of Harvey's own position within them. So thanks very much, Harvey. That was excellent. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And it's nice to see you again, Duncan, of course. For those of you who are still